Karen's scream echoed through the tunnel like a banshee trapped in a culvert. Water was already waist-high, and the HOA board's shiny little convoy of SUVs was nose-deep in a mess they created. One of them was banging on the windows, another yelling into a dead walkie-talkie. Me? I was sitting on top of the tunnel's concrete ledge, sipping sweet tea like it was a Sunday picnic. Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I got here, why the president of the Willowgate HOA is currently trapped in my private tunnel, soaked, panicking, and minutes away from learning what poetic justice actually feels like. Well, let's rewind a bit. It started with the peace only inherited land can offer, a kind of stillness passed down like a secret between generations. My grandfather bought this place in 1946 after returning from the war, when the county was still more cows than commuters. He built the tunnel himself, or at least paid a local crew in cash, beer, and pie to dig it. It was wide enough for cattle, horses, and an old tractor to pass through beneath the county road, a safety measure to avoid dragging livestock across asphalt. Over time, the tunnel became more than just a crossing. It was a line that connected pastures, a hidden shortcut between the barn and the backfield, and in my hands, a well-maintained piece of rural infrastructure. When he passed, I moved back from the city, ditching my marketing gig and buying his tools off my cousins. I kept the place tidy. Fixed the hinges on the steel gates, kept the brush clear from the entrance. The tunnel was mine, along with 28 acres that ran like a horseshoe around the edge of Willowgate Estates, a gated community that looked like it had been vomited out of a catalog and airlifted into the countryside. We never had issues until they hit Phase 4. At first, it was survey trucks, then bored teenagers on e-bikes. Then one day, I noticed a plastic stake driven into the edge of my fence line like a tiny red flag of war. I pulled it up, tossed it in the trash, and thought nothing more of it. But within 2 weeks, my pasture gate, the one that led to the tunnel, had fresh orange spray paint on the ground in front of it. And then came the gravel trucks. I got home from hauling feed one afternoon and found them paving over the old livestock path, filling the ruts with crushed limestone and running a plate compactor over what used to be hoof trails. At first, I thought it was a utility easement job gone sideways. Then I saw the contractor's shirts. They didn't have county logos. They had the HOA's Willowgate Improvement Committee printed in blocky white letters on navy polos like a suburban paramilitary. I stood there with my mouth open as some guy with a clipboard started rattling off permit codes, saying the tunnel had been absorbed into the community's multi-use trail plan. Absorbed? That tunnel was older than their entire neighborhood. I told them to stop. They didn't. They just smiled, nodded, and said to contact Karen with any questions. Karen Mitchell, HOA president, former real estate agent, now self-appointed queen of cul-de-sac regulation. I tried to reach her. Emails bounced. Her assistant couldn't disclose her personal contact information, then they tore my gate clean off. One morning, I drove out to check the southern fence line and found the steel tubing I'd welded myself lying in the weeds, cut at the base like a fallen tree. In its place was a wide open mouth, an invitation. They'd paved the inside of the tunnel, too, added solar lighting strips along the concrete arch. And to top it off, they'd installed a keypad access system on the northern end. I couldn't even walk through the tunnel without getting buzzed in like a delivery man. The worst part? They didn't ask. Not once. They just assumed it was theirs. I found out later they'd filed an emergency access integration request with the county, piggybacking on a school bus reroute application from 2 years ago. It was buried in paperwork no one reads. And once the tunnel was functional, they demolished the original access road into Willowgate, the long winding one that ran through the hills. I watched it get torn apart like a snake shedding skin, the asphalt chewed up and hauled away until nothing was left but dirt and dead weeds. Now the only way in or out of the entire neighborhood was through my tunnel. My private, deed-protected livestock access tunnel. What used to be a peaceful shortcut for me was now bumper-to-bumper minivans, bike trailers, and bored suburbanites cutting across my pasture like they paid rent. One lady even parked on my grass to let her dog pee. I confronted her. She told me to take it up with the board. That was the moment something broke in me. I stood in that field, watching a place I'd spent years restoring get turned into a commuter route for people who didn't know a gate latch from a garden hose, and I knew I had to do something. So I started documenting. I took photos, every car that passed through, every tire tread that marked my soil. I logged dates, times, license plates, even counted the HOA's security golf carts zipping through twice a day like they were on patrol. I checked county maps, dug out the original deed from my grandfather's tin strongbox, and what I found buried in the legalese made me smile. They'd messed up. They'd stolen something they never had a right to. And I was about to make them pay for every single wheel rut, every inch of concrete, and every smug little wave from Karen's Range Rover as she zipped through the tunnel like it was her God-given right. They'd taken my tunnel. Now I was going to take back everything. The first thing I did was walk the length of the demolished road with a measuring wheel and a notebook. The original road to Willow Gate Estates had run from County Route 12 all the way down to the subdivision's gate, a snaking mile of decent blacktop, 2 lanes, striped, with a pull-off for emergency vehicles and signage approved by the county back in 2004. It had wear, sure, but it wasn't beyond repair. Yet according to the HOA's public meeting minutes, which I accessed through a begrudgingly cooperative board member named Cheryl, who still owed me for pulling her truck out of a ditch last winter, the board had voted unanimously to decommission and reconstruct the main road, citing safety concerns, drainage issues, and structural integrity degradation. That was their excuse. The contract they awarded for demolition and grading? $482,000, just to tear the thing up and haul away asphalt. No plans for a new road. Just replacement via alternate neighborhood ingress, which turned out to be my tunnel. I compared the invoice to a county contractor's estimate from the year before, which priced a full mill and repave at $190,000, with emergency grant funding pending from the state. So not only had they bypassed the cheaper option, they'd done so without applying for the financial relief the county had pre-approved. Why? Because it was never about fixing the road. It was about funneling every resident in Willow Gate through my land, under my tunnel, and straight into HOA Karen's glittering little empire. I tried attending a county zoning meeting to raise the issue. Spoke during the public comment section. Wore a button-down, kept it polite. Mentioned the gate theft, the fence damage, the unauthorized demolition. Got a lot of nods. A few sympathetic glances. Then I watched a man in a gray suit whisper into the ear of the zoning chair mid-session. After that, nothing I said mattered. They moved on to the next agenda item like I just asked about dog park hours. I left steaming. A week later, a letter from the zoning board arrived, thanking me for my civic engagement and assuring me that the matter of HOA access infrastructure was reviewed and found compliant with county development ordinances. No signature, just a stamp. That's when I stopped trying to play nice. I dug in. I took a week off work and practically moved into the records office. I brought coffee to the clerk on the morning shift and donuts to the one on the night shift. I pulled every plat map, zoning variance, permit application, and utility easement filed in the last decade, and what I found was a mess of contradictions. The HOA's request to demo the road was filed under infrastructure decommissioning, but their follow-up paperwork reclassified the tunnel as emergency egress enhancement. They tried to call it a fire route, but the fire department had never approved it. In fact, it wasn't even on their maps. The clincher? The tunnel had never been zoned for community traffic. It was listed in every document from 1947 onward as private agricultural undercrossing, non-easement, non-commercial. That meant no one, not even the county, had the right to repurpose it for traffic unless they negotiated directly with the landowner, which, in this case, was me. But it got better. I pulled old floodplain overlays from FEMA and the county engineering office and laid them out side by side. The tunnel sat dead center on a red-striped section marked 100-year flood overflow zone, meaning that in the event of a serious storm, it was legally required to remain unobstructed to allow overflow from Brush Creek. Converting it into a permanent road violated state flood control protocols. I checked the most recent map submission the HOA had filed. The tunnel wasn't labeled as a flood relief passage. They'd white-outed the designation and resubmitted it as a green corridor, and it had passed approval because the submission was signed off by a guy named Brad Keller, head of inspection services for the county. That rang a bell. I looked him up. His mother's maiden name, Mitchell. Karen's maiden name. I cross-referenced social media, local real estate licenses, and a few archived obituaries. Turns out Brad and Karen are cousins. He'd fast-tracked her tunnel application through in 12 business days, a process that normally takes 90. I sent an anonymous request to the county ethics board just to see what would happen. I wasn't holding my breath. But that wasn't the only thing I found in the strongbox buried behind my grandfather's workshop. Wrapped in wax paper and tucked between two property deeds was the original land covenant from 1937, drafted back when the land was first parceled out of the old Eastwood Ranch. It had a clause I'd never noticed before, likely because no one in living memory had reason to enforce it. Section 4C, handwritten, read: "The livestock tunnel constructed by the deed holder shall not be used for commercial or residential traffic, nor shall it serve as right-of-way ingress or egress for neighboring parcels in perpetuity." It had been signed by both the original ranch owner and the county registrar. Not only did the HOA not have a legal easement, the deed explicitly banned what they were doing. The clause hadn't expired. It was permanent, binding, and enforceable. I brought the document to a local attorney I knew from 4-H club days, a woman named Teresa Dale, whose firm specialized in rural property disputes. She read it twice and then said, "Oh yeah, that's a kill shot." The phrase gave me chills, but I didn't want to just stop them. I wanted to make it hurt. I wanted every SUV that rolled through that tunnel to be a witness in the case. Every HOA resident to know exactly who built their shortcut on a lie. So I got to work. Cameras, trail monitors, pressure sensors, infrared lights. I mapped out every license plate that used the tunnel, logged timestamps, kept track of traffic, volume, and flow. I even caught Karen's husband, Bob, using it to host unofficial property tours for prospective buyers, like it was some kind of exclusive Greenway entrance amenity. They were selling my tunnel as a feature. Selling it. That's when I knew it wasn't just entitlement, it was greed. They saw my land as free real estate, a cost-cutting detour they could pave over with HOA bylaws and backroom favors. But I had something they didn't: history, proof, and just enough stormwater infrastructure to make them very, very sorry. That's when the trap began to take shape. They called it the Willow Gate Tunnel Ride, a community bonding experience to celebrate the completion of their new shortcut road. Flyers went up at the HOA clubhouse, on laminated signs zip-tied to mailboxes, even taped to my own fence posts like an invitation to my own execution. Karen's name was stamped across the bottom in curly font, right above the words, "Join us for a ceremonial drive through our beautiful new tunnel entrance." They even planned a pancake breakfast at the start and a balloon arch at the finish, and that's when I knew they'd gotten arrogant, complacent, drunk on their own suburban delusions. They'd paved over my property, erased the floodplain codes, cut me out of the legal process entirely, and now they wanted to parade through my tunnel like conquering heroes. I didn't sleep much that week. Not because I was stressed, because I was wiring shut the floodgates. I'd already filed the formal motion with the county to reclaim private access and enforce the 1937 covenant. I'd submitted annotated floodplain overlays to the State Environmental Board, complete with drone footage, satellite timestamps, and 3 sworn statements from neighboring landowners confirming they'd never granted right-of-way. But none of that would stop the HOA in time, not before the tunnel ride. Bureaucracy moves like molasses, but revenge moves at flood speed. 2 weeks prior, I dug out the old creek intake, a rusted steel grate buried beneath 30 years of silt and poison ivy, and retrofitted it with a reinforced backflow valve I'd salvaged from a condemned feed mill. Upstream, near the springhead that fed Brush Creek during the wet season, I installed a secondary floodgate. Pressure sealed and connected to a buried length of irrigation line, I rigged to a release lever tucked inside a hay bale on the back pasture. A redundant system, just in case one didn't catch. Both gates were manual, but the release lines, those were remote. A little help from an electrician buddy and a second-hand signal relay, and I could open them from my phone. I tested it twice. The pasture flooded in under 15 minutes. Not enough to drown, but enough to send a message. Enough to make people rethink which part of the country they were trespassing through. Meanwhile, I got in touch with someone who still had a nose for scandal. Her name was Alexi Hahn, a journalist for the county's weekly rag who had a personal vendetta against HOA corruption after a board once forced her father to paint his barn taupe. I gave her everything. The photos, the easement maps, the permit inconsistencies, the cousin and code enforcement, the missing municipal grant money that had vanished right after the road was demoed. She was so excited she nearly spilled coffee on my legal binder. She said she'd be there on tunnel day, front row, ready to film. I told her to bring a kayak, just in case. Then came the rain. Not a downpour, not yet, but a steady spring shower that soaked the hills and filled the culverts with a low, steady hum. The water table rose by 1.5 inches overnight. That meant the tunnel would already be damp. All I had to do was open the gates. I parked my truck on the ridge, where I could see both tunnel entrances but not be seen. I brought a thermos of black coffee, a pair of binoculars, and my granddad's old Winchester in case some HOA vigilante decided to go rogue. The first minivan rolled up at 9:13 a.m. sharp. White Honda Odyssey, Karen's. She was wearing a plastic sash that read Board President, like she'd been elected to Congress. Behind her came a line of cars, SUVs, sedans, even a couple of golf carts decorated with streamers. One guy had strapped a giant inflatable eagle to his roof. They had no idea they were about to drive into a concrete coffin. At the far end of the tunnel, HOA volunteers had set up a finish line complete with folding chairs and a portable speaker playing John Denver. That's where Alexi stood with her camera. The plan was simple. Once 5 cars entered the tunnel, enough to ensure gridlock, but not enough to cause permanent damage, I'd activate both floodgates. Then I'd hit the switch on the steel barriers I'd welded over the course of 3 weeks from repurposed cattle guards and a spare hydraulic jack. They were hinged, disguised as livestock fencing, and built to slam shut with over 1,000 pounds of pressure, 1 gate on each end. Once they were inside, there'd be no way out. Karen gave some speech at the head of the convoy. I couldn't hear it, but I'm sure it was full of phrases like community vision and sustainable growth. She waved her clipboard, gestured toward the tunnel, and the parade began. First, her Odyssey. Then a black Lexus with a W. Gloyer vanity plate. Then a Subaru with tennis stickers. then the HOA secretary's Toyota. Then Doug, the HOA treasurer, in his Ford Expedition tailgating like he had somewhere to be. That was my cue. 5 cars in, 24 wheels. $150,000 of suburbia, now sitting in my tunnel. I pulled out my phone, opened the floodgate app, pressed release. The signal relay took 3 seconds to respond. The pressure valves hissed, and then I heard it, the low, throaty rumble of water forced through narrow pipes. At the same time, I pressed the second control. Both tunnel gates slammed shut with a clang that echoed off the ridgeline like a church bell made of vengeance. The reaction was immediate. I saw brake lights, reverse lights. 1 car honked, then 2. But the tunnel was curved, and they couldn't see the water yet, not until it reached the bumpers. And then it came, rising up from both ends like the tunnel itself was exhaling. Brown, silt-heavy runoff poured in from the pasture intake, joined by clear, cold spring water from the north. Within 60 seconds, the water was ankle-deep. By 2 minutes, it was licking the doors. At the far end, I saw the finish line volunteers scatter. 1 golf cart reversed straight into a folding chair. Karen climbed out of her van and started shouting at someone behind her, probably Doug. 1 woman tried her walkie-talkie. Nothing. Dead signal. I hadn't jammed it. Nature had. The water was doing what it always did, finding the path of least resistance. And now that path led straight through the floorboards of HOA leadership. From my ridge, I watched them panic. Watched the Ford back into the Subaru, watched Karen waving her hands like a flight marshal, screaming for someone to do something. But there was nowhere to go. They'd blocked off the old road. Torn down the original gate, put every egg in 1 shortcut, and now that shortcut was a bathtub. Alexi caught it all, every second. Her footage would later get 500,000 views and a write-up in the local Tribune, but for now, I just watched. Silent. Still. The coffee in my thermos was still warm. The rain came down steady. The water rose. And finally, Karen looked up toward the ridge, toward me, and realized who had just pulled the lever on her empire. I tipped my hat. Then I started walking down. Not to rescue, just to say hello. The sirens came long after the screaming stopped. Flashing lights bounced off the tunnel's concrete curves as fire crews waded through knee-deep runoff with bolt cutters, thermal cameras, and a lot of questions. I stood to the side, arms crossed, soaked through but dry where it mattered. I'd already opened the floodgates, no need for actual harm, just enough water to make a point. But even drained, the tunnel still stank of humiliation. Karen was the last one they pulled out, wrapped in a metallic blanket like a war casualty, barking orders at a firefighter half her age who couldn't stop laughing. The Range Rover, bless its over-engineered heart, refused to start. The water had shorted the electronics, and by the time the rescue crew got it to the tunnel mouth, it was pronounced dead on arrival. I heard someone say, "That's what happens when you cut corners on permits," and I may have smiled. That night, Alexi's footage aired on the 10 o'clock news, sandwiched between a story about a runaway emu and a school board recall. Tunnelgate, they called it. The video ran unedited, Karen's voice echoing off the tunnel walls as water gurgled at her knees, the chaos of reverse lights slamming into bumpers, HOA board members climbing onto their roofs like kids playing hot lava. But it was the follow-up piece that really did the damage. Alexi didn't just film the event, she dug deeper. She interviewed the county engineer who'd flagged the floodplain violation, the former treasurer who confirmed Karen had fast-tracked the road demo funds to her cousin's construction firm, even a clerk at the zoning office who admitted she'd been pressured to overlook the missing paperwork. The piece ended with drone footage of the tunnel, now warped and waterlogged, framed with the caption, "Built on a lie." Within 48 hours, the HOA board was in full retreat. Karen tried damage control, released a statement blaming unforeseen weather patterns and miscommunication between subcommittees, But nobody bought it, not after the public records dropped. Not after the county froze HOA accounts pending an audit. Not after Alexi got her hands on the grant misappropriation forms and published the invoice trails showing a 90-0 discrepancy between build demo and actual roadwork performed. That was enough for the DA. Karen was indicted on 3 counts of municipal fraud, 1 count of falsifying public records, and my personal favorite, criminal trespass. She pled not guilty, of course. Hired a lawyer from 2 counties over, but the evidence was stacked higher than the HOA's landscaping violation notices, and the court date was set before summer's end. Meanwhile, I filed my own suit. Trespass, property damage, unauthorized modification of agricultural infrastructure. It took 3 weeks, but I won. Full damages, court-ordered restoration of tunnel access. And, cherry on top, an injunction banning the HOA from conducting any construction within 500 feet of my property line. The HOA tried to appeal. They failed. Then they tried to regroup. Called an emergency board meeting to elect a new president, but only 2 members showed up, and one of them resigned mid-meeting when reporters started asking about missing HOA reserve funds. With no functioning leadership and a pending fraud trial, the county moved to dissolve the HOA charter. Karen's empire crumbled in less than a month. The tunnel, declared unsafe for public use. Permanently closed to vehicle traffic. But not to me. I had the deed, the ruling, and the welding torch. I hired a local metalworker named Denny, same guy who helped me install the floodgates, and together we installed a new entrance gate. Not automatic, not electric. Just a good old-fashioned steel bar gate with a padlock and a sign that read, "Private access, trespassers will be educated." Then came the mural. I painted it myself with a little help from the Thompson kids who used to play by my creek. It spanned the entire outer wall of the tunnel from mossy edge to edge. In the center was a cartoon of a sinking SUV, water up to its mirrors with a caption above it in bold red letters, "The shortcut to consequences." To either side, I added depictions of Karen and her board in exaggerated panic poses, one holding a clipboard like a life raft, another trying to paddle with a garden flag. The community loved it. So much, in fact, that the local arts council nominated it for a Civic Engagement Award. But the real prize came quietly. No ceremony. Just a letter from the Township Zoning Committee, inviting me to serve as an alternate board member. "Your knowledge of land use law and floodplain integrity," they said, "would be a valuable asset. I accepted." Not because I wanted power, but because I wanted a seat at the table next time someone tried to steamroll their way through the past. Willowgate Estates changed after that. Without an HOA, the place softened. Neighbors planted what they wanted. Kids chalked hopscotch on the sidewalks, and nobody got fined for leaving their trash cans out overnight. Some folks moved out, afraid of what a ruleless neighborhood might look like, but more stayed, and the ones who stayed thanked me, brought pies, left handwritten notes. One kid even gave me a Lego model of the tunnel, complete with a tiny Karen figure stuck inside. And then there was the Range Rover. Still half submerged at the base of the tunnel, wedged between 2-wheel ruts like a monument to hubris. Karen never came to claim it. I heard she moved to Florida. Bought a condo with an HOA that only allows beige curtains. I kept the Rover where it was, let the creek slowly reclaim it. Ivy grew through the wheel wells. Birds nested in the cup holders. And on warm afternoons, I'd climb the hill, sit atop the tunnel gate with a cup of sweet tea, and watch the sun glint off its shattered windshield. The town called it an eyesore. I called it justice. And every time the breeze carried the faintest whiff of flooded leather seats and overpriced suburban ego, I leaned back, took a sip, and smiled.